Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we are taking a really granular look, a very focused look at what many consider the true beginning of full-scale U.S. combat in Vietnam.
That's right. We're analyzing the Battle of Ia Drang. It happened in November 1965, and it was just seismic, a huge clash.
Yeah, it served as both a proving ground for some revolutionary new tactics, but also, well, a pretty tragic testament to individual valor.
Absolutely. And this deep dive, we're centering specifically on Landing Zone X-ray. That was really the most intense part of the whole Ia Drang operation.
How's the X-ray?
It's where the U.S. Army's brand new air cavalry doctrine, this whole idea that helicopters could, win the day, ran smack into a brutal, very professionally commanded North Vietnamese Army force, the PAVN.
So our mission today, we want to dissect the incredible acts of courage that were really the core of American survival there.
We do, but we also, I think, have to scrutinize some of the systemic failures, the bureaucratic silence, maybe, that often delayed official recognition for some of the most critical heroes, sometimes for decades.
Decades, yeah. Our sources, they really lay out a high-stakes story. It's about technology, doctrine, desperation, and ultimately sacrifice.
And for you, the learner, understanding this battle is, well, it's essential, because it fundamentally defined how the U.S. fought the rest of the war, and how it thought about the war, too.
Right. We need to understand not just what happened, but maybe the institutional lessons learned, or maybe not learned. And crucially, the extraordinary human cost.
It's really the moment when the military, which was transitioning from just an advisory capacity, suddenly realized the scale of the commitment it was truly making. Let's maybe unpack the strategic backdrop first. What led us into the Valley of Death, as it became known?
Okay, so U.S. involvement in Vietnam. It didn't just start with Ia Drang, obviously. It was more of a slow boil, right?
Exactly. Our sources trace that timeline back to when the French left in 1954.
So what was the original U.S. commitment defined as?
Initially, it was, well, pretty standard for post-colonial situations, primarily advisory roles, training, support, that kind of thing.
The goal being to build up the South Vietnamese Army, the ARVN.
Yeah, build up the ARVN into a force that could handle the Viet Cong insurgency on its own. We were sending instructors, providing equipment, doctrine, but crucially, not combat troops. Not initially.
But that role, it expanded pretty quickly, didn't it?
Yeah.
Under Kennedy, then Johnson. The commitment just kept growing.
It did. The scale started creeping up significantly. Kennedy, he recognized the seriousness of the internal threat, so he authorized sending in special forces, Green Berets, to train and assist.
Okay.
And by 1963, the number of U.S. troops had gone from just a few hundred to over 16,000.
16,000. That's a big jump.
A huge jump. But even then, it was still technically defined as counterinsurgency, security, training tasks, not direct combat.
But 1965, that's the real watershed year, isn't it?
Absolutely. That's when the first official U.S. combat troops were deployed. And that just fundamentally changed the nature of American participation.
We went from support personnel to direct confrontation.
And this shift, it didn't happen in a vacuum. The PAVN, the North Vietnamese Army, they were actively testing the boundaries, testing the resolve of this new American presence.
Which brings us to that precursor conflict in October 65, the attack on the Special Forces camp at Plai My. That's really critical context for Ia Drang, right?
It's absolutely critical. Plai My was about, 17 miles east of the Ia Drang Valley?
In that attack, it showcased classic PAVN strategy, didn't it? It wasn't really about just taking the camp.
No, it was much more sophisticated. A really clever ambush tactic, something the communist forces used again and again very effectively.
How did it work?
Well, the PAVN 32nd Regiment attacked the camp, but they deliberately stopped short of completely overwhelming it.
Why do that? Why not finish it off?
To draw in a relieving force. They were essentially using the American and ARVN defenders inside the camp as bait.
Ah, okay.
Exactly. They were counting on the ARVN launching a rescue mission, and that would allow the PAVN's other units waiting nearby to spring a meticulously prepared trap on the roads leading to the camp.
Wow. A calculated risk. If it worked, it could inflict massive losses on the South Vietnamese.
Devastating losses, yeah, and really demoralize the defenders.
But it didn't quite go according to plan for the PAVN at Plai My, did it?
It didn't, not entirely. The U.S. and ARVN forces, they counterattacked aggressively. They actually managed to engage the waiting PAVN force, the 33rd Regiment.
And they hit him hard.
They crippled them pretty badly. Sent both the 32nd and the 33rd Regiments retreating westward, back towards the Cambodian border.
And this immediate retreat, This brings us right to that central strategic frustration of the entire war, doesn't it?
It really does. The sanctuary issue.
They could just slip across the border into Cambodia or Laos, places where U.S. ground troops were forbidden to follow.
It was a tactical nightmare for the U.S. command. The Chu Pong this huge mountain complex that dominates the Ia Drang area, it sits right on the Cambodian border.
A known enemy stronghold.
A major one. Our sources confirm it. It was a primary entry point for troops and supplies coming down the Ho Chi Minh Trail into the Central Highlands.
So the enemy could basically choose when and where to fight.
Right. Fight until the pressure got too intense and then just melt away. Disappear into a protected neutral zone to refit, reorganize, and come back later.
It sounds like a recipe for strategic stalemate. If you can't pursue the enemy into their safe havens.
You need a radical new approach, something completely different.
And that is exactly where these new air mobility tactics come in, championed by the 1st Cavalry Division, Airmobile.
Precisely. This was the U.S. military's big technological bet, an attempt to use technology to overcome geography and those political limitations.
So the decision was made, fully deploy this new air mobility concept, designed specifically for Vietnam's terrain.
That's right. The core idea was using helicopters, mainly the UH-1 Huey, to insert, supply, and extract a large force like a battalion really quickly, right into the hot zones.
Turning the jungle itself into a sort of tactical advantage through vertical movement.
Vertical envelopment, yeah.
Of the doctrine. Let's dig into the details here, because it's not just about troop transport. How did helicopters replace the heavy firepower you'd normally have? Tanks, artillery, that sort of thing.
That's a really critical point. In a normal operation, you'd rely on tanks, APCs, big towed artillery pieces for protection and suppression fire.
But the terrain around Chu Pong?
Yeah.
Mountains, heavy vegetation, that was impossible.
Absolutely impossible. So the air cavalry had to rely on a different kind of firepower delivered from the air, a layered system.
You mentioned aerial rocket artillery, ARA. That was part of it.
The key part. The UH-1B helicopters, the gunships, were armed with racks of 2.75-inch rockets, unguided rockets, plus heavy machine guns.
So they acted like flying artillery.
Basically, yeah.
Yeah.
Rapid, mobile artillery. They could saturate a landing zone, an LZ, just before the troops went in, and they could provide continuous, responsive fire support once the troops were on the ground, sometimes much faster than conventional artillery could react.
So you have the slicks, the troop carriers, and the gunships providing cover. What about keeping them supplied?
Logistics became entirely vertical, too. Everything, ammo, water, medical supplies, it all had to come in by helicopter.
Which creates a single, very vulnerable point, doesn't it? The helicopters themselves.
A huge vulnerability. The whole doctrine was high risk, high reward. It banked on speed and surprise to overcome the enemy's ground defenses.
And the Ia Drang Valley. This was its first real-world, large-scale test.
The biggest test yet. The entire fate of the air cavalry concept kind of hung on whether this theory could actually work against a massive, determined, professional enemy force.
It's an ingenious idea, technologically speaking, using air power to negate the enemy's safe havens. But, as we know, when theory meets a deeply entrenched reality, the results can be, well, catastrophic.
So the Ia Drang operation kicks off. The mission, find those retreating PAVN regiments near the Chu Pong Massif.
And Lieutenant Colonel Hal Moore, commanding the 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry Regiment, he gets the job of being the spearhead, an unenviable task.
Definitely. Moore had to pick a landing zone in LZ. He chose LZ X-ray.
Not the easiest spot, maybe, but the most direct route to the enemy.
Exactly. He picked X-ray specifically because it was the closest viable clearing to where they thought the enemy was concentrated, near Chu Pong Mountain and the Ia Drang River.
And his strategy was about speed. Hit them hard and fast.
Yeah, before they could completely slip back across the border into Cambodia. And to help with that speed and surprise, he decided against a long preparatory bombardment.
Because that would give the enemy too much warning time to prepare.
Right. He ordered just a short, sharp 30-minute barrage, artillery, and those aerial rocket artillery gunships. Just enough, he hoped, to be a shock action. Clear the immediate LZ of any snipers, maybe, but not long enough for the PAVN to get all their forces perfectly positioned to counter a major landing.
But the way the deployment worked, with the helicopters having to go back for more troops, it created this terrifying vulnerability for Moore's first Hueys, didn't it?
Complete and utter isolation. There were only 16 Hueys available for the troop lifts, And they had a long round trip, 34 miles back to the base camp at Plamy to pick up the next wave of soldiers.
How long did that take?
It meant Moore and his first 90 men, the very first boots on the ground at X-Ray, were completely alone for at least 30 minutes, surrounded by dense, totally unknown jungle.
Reading the accounts, the anxiety must have been just immense, especially when they started finding signs of recent enemy activity almost immediately after landing.
Oh, yeah. Moore's initial confidence, whatever he had, it evaporated really quickly. Within the first hour, he's expressing serious doubts. The signs on the ground suggested a much larger enemy force than the intelligence briefings had indicated.
And then came that crucial piece of information, the game changer.
The capture of a young PAVN deserter, right there, near the LZ.
And that capture provided the critical, horrifying reality check. What did he tell them?
He basically shattered the existing intelligence picture. The intel had suggested they were chasing maybe one, possibly two weakened PAVN regiments that were dispersed and retreating.
But the deserter said,
he stated very clearly there were 2 fresh regiments waiting right there on the mountain, but the actual reality, which they only confirmed later through prisoner interrogations and captured documents, it was even worse.
Worse than 2 regiments.
Much worse. It turned out the 32nd, the 33rd, and the elite 66 PAVN regiments were all concentrated right there in the Ia Drang area near Chu Pong.
3 full regiments.
3 regiments. Moore's 1st Battalion had essentially landed right on top of them. Maybe 2,000, perhaps even up to 4,000 dedicated, well-trained North Vietnamese soldiers.
So instead of chasing a beaten enemy, those first 90 guys found themselves facing a force that potentially outnumbered them.
Oh.
What, 10 to 1? Maybe more?
At least 10 to 1 against that initial landing force, yeah. And maybe 4 or 5 to 1 against the full battalion once everyone eventually arrived, which highlights a second huge disadvantage: the terrain itself.
Describe LZ X-ray. What was it like?
It was tiny. Sources describe it as barely the size of a football field. A small clearing surrounded by really dense elephant grass, thickets, termite mounds, basically dense jungle pressing in on all sides.
Which gave the enemy perfect cover.
Perfect cover, right up to the edge of the American perimeter. It was the worst possible scenario for a helicopter insertion, really.
A small LZ surrounded by impenetrable cover, facing a vastly superior enemy force.
Absolutely. And the limited visibility just compounded the bad intelligence. They were fighting blind, essentially, against an enemy who knew the terrain intimately and was poised to exploit the Americans' immediate disadvantage.
The air cavalry doctrine relied on that vertical movement, the air support.
Right, but once the fighting got close, down in the dense scrub around the LZ perimeter, the effectiveness of air power became really limited. You risk hitting your own troops, it becomes close-quarters infantry fighting.
And the fighting erupted pretty quickly, didn't it? About 90 minutes after the first troops landed, November 14th, 1965.
Yeah, about an hour and a half in. And the American soldiers realized almost immediately this was something totally new. A different kind of war.
How so?
It was a fundamental shift in understanding. They knew instantly they weren't fighting local Viet Cong guerrillas anymore, who often used hit-and-run tactics.
These were professional.
Highly motivated, professional North Vietnamese Army regulars, the PAVN. Disciplined, well-trained, well-equipped for conventional, sustained engagements. This wasn't just a skirmish, this was a full-scale, brutal assault aimed at completely annihilating the American battalion.
So Moore's 1st Battalion, and later the elements of the 2nd Battalion that managed to get in to reinforce them, their mission changed instantly.
Completely. It devolved from an offensive search-and-destroy mission into a desperate, sustained, 3-day battle for sheer survival.
And this is what really cements Ia Drang as that turning point. The first massive, sustained clash between U.S. forces and professional NVA regulars.
You know, when you're pinned down like that, outnumbered maybe 10 to 1, surrounded, really only 2 things matter above all else.
Ammunition and casualty.
Exactly. Getting ammo and water in and getting the wounded out, that became the absolute difference between survival and just total annihilation at LZ X-Ray.
But getting anything in or out meant flying straight into the teeth of the enemy fire. And the PAVN knew exactly where to concentrate their guns.
Oh, absolutely. Their focus shifted almost entirely to cutting that air lifeline, shutting down the helicopters.
Captain Ed W. Freeman, one of the Huey pilots flying the unarmed, slick transports that day, he described how quickly things went bad.
He did. It's a chilling account. He said the first few drops, maybe the first 4 lifts into X-ray, felt like a cakewalk. Relatively easy. But then, suddenly, the whole world changed.
He said on the 5th lift, they cut us in 2. They had 3 regiments on the side of that hill and they were dug in.
Yeah. That quote just perfectly captures the transition. It went from a surprise encounter to an entrenched, prepared killing zone for helicopters.
Freeman described the sheer volume of anti-aircraft fire.
He said the PAVN were just eating helicopters live. His own Huey took something like 50-something rounds on just one trip in and out.
50 hits? That's incredible. The aircraft could even fly.
Barely. The enemy fire became so intense, so sustained, that after Freeman managed to limp back with his badly damaged helicopter, the official decision was made. All subsequent helicopter operations into LZ X-ray were formally shut down. Grounded.
That decision, shutting down the air bridge, I mean, that's effectively a death sentence for the guys on the ground, isn't it?
Yeah.
They're running low on ammo, water, and the number of wounded is climbing fast.
Critically fast. It was basically institutional paralysis caused by overwhelming risk. The command structure felt they couldn't justify losing more helicopters and crews.
And adding to that paralysis was military regulation itself.
Right. This is crucial. The regulation regarding medical evacuation, medevac flights, this is where official policy just slammed into an impossible reality on the ground.
Tell us about that regulation. What did it require?
Standard operating procedure, the military policy, demanded that for an unarmed medevac helicopter to land, the LZ had to be confirmed green.
Green meaning?
Meaning safe. No enemy fire observed in or around the landing zone for at least 5 continuous minutes.
5 minutes of silence. But LZ X-ray?
LZ X-ray had been under continuous, intense, heavy assault for hours. It was the absolute definition of a red or hot LZ. Following the rules, following procedure, meant leaving the wounded Americans on the ground to die. There was no way it would be green for 5 minutes.
So the system, the official policy, basically abandoned the troops on the ground at that point?
Effectively, yes. The system failed them in that moment, but individual heroism stepped in to fill that lethal gap.
Major Bruce Crandall, he was the commander of the Huey lift unit, right?
That's right. Crandall saw exactly what was happening, a disaster unfolding, and he knew the regulations were impossible, so he made a decision. He called for a volunteer pilot to fly back into the hot LZ with him, unarmed, against orders, essentially.
And Captain Ed W. Freeman was the one who stepped forward, the only one initially.
The only one who volunteered right then.
What drove them? Why defy policy, risk court-martial, risk almost certain death flying back in there?
For Freeman, as he recounted it later, it came down to a really deep personal sense of moral obligation. His simple explanation was, I put him in there.
Meaning the soldiers on the ground?
Yeah. They were his responsibility. He had flown them into that hell, and if the army wouldn't fly them out, he felt he had to. It was pure volunteerism, pure courage, filling a massive, deadly institutional void.
We really need to spend a moment on the sheer physical effort and bravery of these two men. What they did was, statistically speaking, suicidal.
Start with Major Crandall. On that single day, November 14th, he flew his unarmed Huey into that kill zone 22 times.
22 separate flights into heavy, concentrated enemy fire.
22 times. Think about what that means. He's bringing in desperately needed ammo, water, medical supplies, and on the way out, he's loading up with wounded soldiers, flying them back to safety.
He must have been taking hits constantly.
Constantly. He was flying so aggressively, taking so much damage, that he had to keep switching helicopters. He'd fly one until it was too shot up to be safe, land it, jump into another one, and go straight back in.
And Captain Freeman flying alongside him, making 14 volunteer flights himself.
14 flights into that inferno. He logged an almost unbelievable 14.5 hours of continuous flying time that day, in and out of X-ray.
How do they even sustain that pace?
They developed this dangerous routine just to save every possible second. They did hot refueling, never shutting down the helicopter engines back at the staging area. They just pumped fuel in while the rotors were still turning.
Wow.
They ate sea rations while flying the 13-minute legs between the base camp and LZ X-ray. They were like machines, driven by necessity, refusing to stop, refusing to break down.
The impact of what they did, it's staggering. How many lives are they credited with saving?
Our sources credit Crandall and Freeman with evacuating more than 70 wounded soldiers on that first day alone. 70 men who almost certainly would have died without evacuation.
So it's not an exaggeration to say that without them defying orders, flying into that nonstop ambush, the entire 1st Battalion might have been wiped out. Lack of ammo, overwhelming casualties.
It's absolutely not an exaggeration. Their actions were decisive. Their relief flights only stopped late that night around 10:30 p.m. And only when Lieutenant Colonel Moore, the commander on the ground, finally felt confident enough to radio Crandall and say, basically, okay, we got enough now. I think I can last till daylight. You can shut it down.
That assessment, the survival of the battalion until daylight. It rests almost entirely on the courage of those two pilots.
It does. Two men who risked absolutely everything.
And yet, their official recognition, the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest award for valor. It took more than 40 years to happen.
40 years. We definitely need to hold on to that fact. We'll come back to analyze that institutional failure, that delay, a bit later. It's a critical part of this story.
So, the air lifeline provided by Crandall and Freeman enabled survival. But the minute-to-minute fighting, holding the line on the ground, that was down to the infantrymen. And their commander, Lieutenant Colonel Hal Moore. He was recognized fairly quickly, wasn't he?
Relatively quickly, yes. He was promoted to colonel and awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, which is the second highest U.S. military decoration, in June of 1966, just about 7 months after the battle.
And his citation, it wasn't just about personal bravery, was it? It highlighted his command skills under extreme pressure.
Exactly. He was praised for his great skill and foresight in directing accurate fire support artillery and airstrikes. But what seems truly life-saving, based on the accounts, was his constant movement and his uncanny ability to predict what the enemy would do next.
So he wasn't just holed up in a command bunker somewhere.
Far from it. The sources say Moore moved constantly from position to position around the LZ X-ray perimeter. He was providing crucial moral support just by being seen, but maybe more importantly, he was making successful predictions of insurgent attack plans.
How vital was that predictive ability?
Against an enemy that outnumbered them so heavily, anticipation was everything. If you knew where the main thrust was likely to come, you could shift your defenses.
His citation mentions his ability to shift men and firepower at a moment's notice.
Yes, and that allowed the battalion to meet and ultimately repulse a major, absolutely savage PAVN assault on the third day of the battle. If Moore had been slower or more rigid in his defensive setup, the perimeter almost certainly would have been breached and the battalion overrun. His active mobile command presence had the unit together.
Okay, but the highest honor for ground combat, the Medal of Honor, that went to Lieutenant Walter Marm. His award came in December 1966. His actions seemed to exemplify that kind of individual, brutal, close-quarters fighting needed to break the NVA attacks.
They really do. Marm was a second lieutenant, a platoon leader in Company A. His unit was involved in the effort to reach and relieve the cut-off 2nd Platoon of Company B, the famous Lost Platoon.
And they ran into a major obstacle.
A huge one. As they were advancing, they got pinned down by a heavily entrenched NVA machine gun position. It was located inside a large, fortified permite mound, perfectly sited to block their path.
So how did Marm break that stalemate? It sounds like a suicide mission to attack something like that.
Well, he realized they simply couldn't move forward until that machine gun was silenced. So first, according to his Medal of Honor citation, he demonstrated indomitable courage by deliberately exposing himself to the enemy fire, just stepping out into the open.
Why would he do that?
To pinpoint the exact location of the gunner inside the mound. Once he knew where it was, he tried to take it out with a light anti-tank weapon, a law rocket. But it failed. Didn't destroy the position.
So facing a complete tactical deadlock with his platoon pinned down and unable to advance.
Marm did the unthinkable. He charged the position. Alone.
Charged it. Straight on.
Straight on. He threw grenades as he ran, killing several enemy soldiers inside and around the mound. Then he used his M16 rifle to finish off the remaining defenders who were operating the machine gun. It was a single-man assault that just completely eliminated that critical strong point.
Incredible. Did he survive?
He did, miraculously. He was wounded in the process, but he survived. And it's worth noting, Marm himself later emphasized that while his action was recognized, it was fundamentally part of a total team effort. He credited the survival of the battalion to many factors, including the constant air support, something like 100 Air Force tactical airstrikes over the 3 days of fighting at X-ray.
And that relief effort he was part of was heading towards the Lost Platoon, a unit that suffered just horrendous casualties, but somehow refused to break. And a lot of that was down to Sergeant Clyde Savage.
Absolutely. Sergeant Savage's story is remarkable. He was a squad leader in that 2nd Platoon of Company B. When the battle erupted, his platoon got cut off from the main body of the battalion, completely surrounded.
And their leadership was hit hard, fast.
Instantly decimated. The platoon leader, the platoon sergeant, the weapons squad leader, all killed or seriously wounded very early on. So Savage, just a sergeant, a squad leader, found himself the senior man left standing and took command of the surviving men.
Imagine that. Surrounded, cut off, minimal supplies, leaders gone.
Yeah.
Having to rally the survivors and hold out for, how long was it?
For 26 hours. 26 hours completely surrounded, under constant attack.
How did they manage it?
Savage's leadership was key, and he resorted to extreme measures to defend their tiny, desperate perimeter. One of the most cited examples is that during the night, he called for artillery fire support extremely close to their own position.
How close?
Within 50 meters. 50 meters! Think about that. Calling in high explosive shells to land less than half a football field away from where you and your men are huddled.
The trust in the artillery crews, the sheer desperation.
It had to be done. It was the only way to break up the NVA human wave assaults that were trying to overrun them in the darkness. The danger from friendly fire was preferable to being wiped out.
And his personal actions?
His Distinguished Service Cross citation mentions that the following morning, as the NVA pressed closer again, Savage personally shot more than 30 enemy soldiers trying to breach their perimeter. His leadership, his example, it absolutely influenced his men to hold out until help finally arrived. He received his DSC in February 1966.
Then there's the story of Lieutenant John L. Geoghegan, a truly tragic example of immediate, selfless sacrifice.
Geoghegan's actions really capture the personal, visceral horror of LZ X-ray. He was recognized posthumously after his death with the Silver Star, the Bronze Star, Purple Heart, and Air Medal.
What happened?
He was in his command post, a foxhole, trying to direct his men, and he heard one of his soldiers, Specialist 4 Willie F. Godbolt, cry out nearby. Godbolt had been hit, badly wounded.
And Geoghegan left his cover.
Immediately, without hesitation. His citation reads that he selflessly exposed himself to the sheets of enemy fire as he ran across open ground towards the wounded Specialist Godbolt, trying to reach him, to help him.
He didn't make it.
No. He was fatally wounded in the attempt. And there's that profoundly moving detail. Their names, Geoghegan and Godbolt, are listed right next to each other on the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Wall in Washington, D.C. 2 lives extinguished in that one moment of duty and attempted rescue.
It's heartbreaking. And then, circling back to the issue of delayed recognition, it wasn't just the pilots, was it? There were ground soldiers whose crucial actions took decades to be formally acknowledged, like Specialists Bill Beck and Russell Adams.
Oh, that's right. These 2 soldiers, Specialists 4 Beck and Adams, were in Platoon 3 of Company A. Their position was absolutely critical. They held the flank, the side edge of LZ X-ray, and they held it for hours against just a constant, relentless stream of NVA trying to break through.
So their stand was vital for preventing the whole perimeter from collapsing.
Absolutely vital. If that flank had given way, the enemy could have rolled up the entire American line. Their defensive action was just as crucial for the battalion's overall survival as any of the more famous offensive actions.
Yet they waited almost 3 decades for official recognition.
Nearly 30 years. They were finally awarded the Bronze Star Medal with Valor device in 1996.
Why the delay?
It underscores that same problem we talked about earlier, the sheer chaos of the battle. If the witnesses who saw their actions were killed or wounded, if the paperwork wasn't filed immediately amidst the carnage, if things just got lost in the shuffle, decades could pass before someone pieced the story together and pushed for the recognition they deserved.
It's a recurring theme. And finally, we can't overlook a unique figure in this story of valor, a civilian, Joseph L. Galloway, the war correspondent.
Right. Galloway's case is remarkable. He is the only civilian journalist awarded a medal for heroism by the U.S. Army during the entire Vietnam War. He received the Bronze Star Medal with Valor.
And this was for actions at LZ X-ray.
Yes. He was embedded with the 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry, living with them, leaving with them, reporting on them, but he went beyond reporting.
What did he do?
The source material, including his own accounts and those of soldiers, confirms that on the 2nd day of the fighting at X-ray, Galloway disregarded his own safety to help rescue 2 wounded soldiers while under fire.
He wasn't obligated to do that as a reporter?
Not at all. He had no military duty to expose himself like that, but he saw soldiers in need and acted instinctively to help save their lives, right alongside the other infantrymen. His Bronze Star wasn't awarded until much later, in January 1998, but it's an incredible testament to his courage and his bond with the soldiers he covered.
So the valor at Ia Drang was undeniable. Across the board, pilots, infantry, command, even a civilian. But the system, the mechanism for recognizing that valor, it was clearly flawed, inconsistent, and often painfully slow.
Okay, so as we shift from those incredible individual actions to the broader legacy of Ia Drang, we first have to confront the cost, the staggering human cost of this battle.
The numbers are brutal. Just looking at that main period, November 14th through 18th, covering both LZ X-ray and the subsequent fight at LZ Albany, U.S. forces suffered 237 killed in action.
and another 258 wounded.
And focusing just on LZ X-ray itself, that small football field-sized clearing, 70 Americans died there, and 120 were wounded over those 3 days.
And we have to remember the South Vietnamese forces, the ARVN, were involved too, especially in the Play Me prelude and surrounding actions. They also paid a heavy price. 132 ARVN soldiers killed, 248 wounded during that campaign period.
What about the enemy losses? The PAVN U.S. estimates were very high, weren't they?
Extremely high. U.S. Military Assistance Command, Vietnam MACV, estimated communist losses between 1,037 and 1,745 killed across the entire Ia Drang campaign. Though it's important to note, the PAVN later contested those figures strongly, claiming their actual losses were roughly half that total.
Regardless of the exact number, it was clearly a very bloody, very high-intensity fight for both sides. A meat grinder.
Absolutely. But talking about the cost and the legacy, we can't just focus on LZ X-ray and frame it as some kind of costly American victory or survival story, because what happened immediately after X-ray complicates that narrative immensely.
You're talking about LZ Albany?
Exactly. The fighting shifted almost immediately from the relatively successful defense at X-ray to a different location nearby, LZ Albany. And the outcome there, on November 17th mainly, was an unmitigated disaster for the Americans.
What often gets glossed over, but LZ Albany was horrific, wasn't it?
Horrific. Albany holds the grim distinction of being the deadliest single day of battle for American forces in the entire Vietnam War, up to that point and for quite some time after.
Why? Why did things go so terribly wrong at Albany? Just days after the desperate but ultimately successful defense at X-ray, what happened?
It seems like a confluence of several factors, all highlighting how difficult it was to sustain that kind of high-intensity airmobile operation successfully. First, simple exhaustion. The American troops, particularly from the 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry, who were involved at Albany, were physically and emotionally drained after the fighting at X-ray or the march towards it.
Understandable. What else?
Possibly some complacency crept in. Maybe a feeling that the main enemy force had been decisively beaten back at X-ray. And third, and this seems critical from the analyses, the command structure and tactical situation were different.
Different from Moore's tight control at X-ray.
Very different. The units involved at Albany were essentially marching overland, not inserted directly into a hot LZ under heavy covering fire. They were moving through unfamiliar, dense terrain and walked straight into a massive, well-prepared PAVN ambush, a classic L-shaped ambush.
And they didn't have the same level of immediate coordinated air and artillery support that Moore had orchestrated at X-ray.
It seems not nearly as effectively coordinated in the initial chaos. The units got fragmented, command broke down quickly, and they were just shattered by overwhelming enemy fire from hidden positions.
The result was devastating. What were the casualties at Albany?
In just a few hours of fighting at LZ Albany, 151 American soldiers were killed and another 121 wounded.
151 killed in a single day's action. That's staggering.
It is. It serves as this immediate, tragic counterpoint to the story of survival at X-ray. The Ia Drang campaign, taken as a whole, demonstrated both the incredible potential of the new air cavalry concept and the absolute ruthlessness and skill the PAVN possessed to counter that advantage. It really set the brutal tone for the rest of the war.
And this incredibly high mortality rate, the sheer chaos of the fighting at both X-ray and Albany. It brings us back to that painful point Hal Moore made about unrecognized valor.
Yeah, Moore's reflection on this, documented in his book We Were Soldiers Once, and Young, which he co-wrote with Joe Galloway, it's just heartbreaking. He lamented that he personally witnessed or knew of so many acts of incredible bravery deeds that absolutely deserved the Medal of Honor, or the Distinguished Service Cross, or the Silver Star that just went completely unrecognized by the official award system.
And the reason was horrifyingly simple, wasn't it?
Horrifyingly simple and brutally final. The witnesses were dead.
The men who could have provided the necessary eyewitness accounts, the corroboration needed for the medal paperwork.
They were killed in the same action, or shortly after. Or the commanders who might have initiated the award recommendations were killed or wounded and evacuated. And the sheer intensity and chaos of that kind of sustained, close-quarters fighting, the administrative process for documenting heroism just completely broke down.
So for the families of those unrecognized heroes.
For too many families, the only official notification they received from the U.S. Army was that standard, cold telegram of condolence. Their loved one's bravery was real, witnessed perhaps only by comrades who also didn't survive, but the official record remained incomplete, silent.
It's a profound institutional failure born out of battlefield chaos. And that failure, or at least delay, leads us right back to the pilots, Bruce Crandall and Ed Freeman. Their heroism was witnessed by hundreds of survivors on the ground whose lives they saved. Yet their highest honors took over 40 years. We really need to try and understand the reasons for that specific delay.
It's a complex question, and the delay tells us a lot about the military bureaucracy, maybe the political climate surrounding Vietnam during and especially after the war. You know, it's striking that many of the infantry heroes from Ia Drang, like Marm and Savage, they received their high decorations relatively quickly in 1966. But the pilots waited decades. Why?
Could it be a sort of bias in the awards system itself, maybe favoring traditional ground-based combat heroism, charging a machine gun nest, holding a defensive line over acts that might have been perceived, initially at least, as logistical support or evacuation, even if incredibly dangerous?
That's certainly one plausible theory. The Medal of Honor criteria often emphasized direct personal action against the enemy. While Crandall and Freeman's flights were undeniably heroic and involved direct exposure to enemy fire, their primary function was flying unarmed helicopters for transport and medevac. Maybe the category of their action didn't fit the traditional mold quite as neatly in the eyes of the initial review boards.
So, the way their bravery manifested itself might have worked against them bureaucratically at first, even though the risk they took was arguably just as high, if not higher, than many ground actions.
It seems possible, yeah. And you also have to consider the broader context, the political and public atmosphere surrounding the Vietnam War, especially through the late 60s, the 70s, and even into the 80s. It was deeply divisive and often toxic.
Did that affect the awards process?
It likely complicated things. There might have been periods of intense scrutiny, maybe even a reluctance within parts of the military or government establishment to push forward high-profile awards tied to such a controversial and ultimately unsuccessful conflict. It wasn't until years later, fueled by the dedicated, sustained advocacy from the very soldiers Crandall and Freeman saved the infantrymen on the ground, who never forgot that the review process was forced back into motion.
So it took the men they saved to keep pushing for decades.
That seems to be a major factor. Their testimony, their persistence, finally broke through the bureaucratic inertia. And eventually, it resulted in Ed Freeman receiving his Medal of Honor in 2001 and Bruce Crandall receiving his in 2007.
More than 40 years after they flew into LZ X-ray, it really highlights a painful gap, doesn't it, between the reality of battlefield courage and the workings of institutional memory and recognition.
It really underscores that the process of awarding military honors isn't always immediate or purely objective. It can be long, incredibly slow, and subject to all sorts of political winds, bureaucratic hurdles, and the simple, tragic fact of incomplete paperwork from a chaotic battlefield, especially when the war itself remains contentious for so long.
But despite that long, difficult road to official honor for some of the key heroes, the story of Ia Drang itself, it didn't fade away. It actually found its way into the broader cultural consciousness relatively quickly.
It did. The battle became the basis for that critically acclaimed best-selling book, We Were Soldiers Once In, and Young, co-written by Hal Moore himself and Joe Galloway, the reporter who was there. That book became a truly foundational text for understanding the human experience of the Vietnam War for a whole generation.
And then, much later, the powerful 2002 movie based on the book, We Were Soldiers.
Right, starring Mel Gibson as Hal Moore. That film brought the visceral reality of LZ X-ray to an even wider audience. So this cultural legacy really cemented Ia Drang in the public mind as that quintessential, brutal introduction to the realities of the Vietnam War. Interestingly, long before Crandall and Freeman, two of the most critical heroes depicted, actually received their Medals of Honor at the White House. #outro.
Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive into the Valley of Death, let's distill some essential takeaways for you, the listener.
Yeah.
What should we remember about Ia Drang?
Well, first, I think, is that Ia Drang wasn't just another battle. It was a fundamental shift, a turning point.
How so?
It was the first major test of those new air mobility tactics against a truly professional, conventional enemy, the NVA. And it confirmed almost immediately that the U.S. was now committed to a massive, potentially very long ground war against a dedicated, highly competent, and often numerically superior opponent. The gloves were off.
Right. And second takeaway, the survival of that American unit at LZ X-ray. It wasn't just one thing, was it?
Not at all. It hinged entirely on this complex, integrated combination of factors.
Yeah.
You had Hal Moore's agile, predictive, on-the-ground tactical command. You had the technological advantage, however strained, of the air cavalry doctrine, the helicopters, the firepower. And crucially, you had the superhuman, almost unbelievable selfless actions of individual soldiers.
People like Crandall, Freeman, Marm, Savage, who stepped up and overcame system failures, overcame impossible odds through sheer will and volunteer courage.
Exactly. All of those elements working together, skilled command technology and raw individual bravery, that was the bare minimum required just to survive that encounter.
So the profound lesson here seems to be that when the new doctrine, the air mobility concept, was truly tested under extreme pressure, the courage and initiative of the individual soldier had to compensate for the inherent vulnerabilities of the system, especially that reliance on a fragile vertical logistics lifeline in such a high-intensity fight.
Well put. Okay, so here's maybe a final provocative thought for you, our listener, to consider as we close out. When a society, or its military establishment, takes decades, literally decades, to officially recognize acts of undeniable, life-saving heroism, particularly in cases like Crandall and Freeman, whose actions arguably saved the entire engagement at X-Ray, what does that long, winding road to honor really tell us about our historical priorities?
Are we, perhaps subconsciously, valuing certain types of bravery, maybe the direct infantry charge over other forms, like sustained logistical courage under fire?
It's a question worth asking. And what institutional changes, if any, might be needed to ensure that bureaucratic inertia or political climate or just lost paperwork never again allows genuine, witnessed, immediate sacrifice to be overshadowed or delayed for so long? What does that long road to honor really reveal about how we remember war and who we choose to remember first?